Hello, everyone. This is Amy Brown, Director of Events and Education for Trade Press Media Group. Thank you for joining us for today's webcast, Facility Violence, Prevention and Response. Today's webcast learning objectives include understanding the data and the hype, recognizing the phenomenon of a leakage, understand what we got wrong and our reaction to active shooter situations, and comprehending common sense principles to save lives. Before we get started with today's webcast, I'd like to cover just a few details. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Traka, who's part of the Asset Alloy family. They can help manage key and equipment management. We do encourage questions from our audience throughout today's webcast. And to submit your question, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We'll answer as many as time permits. At the conclusion of today's webcast, you'll receive a link to a brief online assessment. Upon successfully completion of the assessment, you'll receive your CEU certificate. Today's webcast will also be archived at facilitiesnet.com/webcast. Our presenter today is Sean Ahrens, who's a security expert. Sean has worked with several clients and detected a wide range of vulnerabilities that are expressed through architecture, security technology, and operations. Over the years, he has collected, analyzed, and made use of public data to make informed decisions about business risks for his clients. Working as a security expert in Chicago, Illinois, he has witnessed, documented, and recommended controls for common vulnerabilities, which, if uncorrected, could lead to loss. Before I turn it over to Sean, just a warning that today's presentation will use video clips and they might be sensitive for some individuals. Sean, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Amy. I really appreciate it. Let me share my screen real quick here. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes,
Yep,
you can.
looks good.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thanks for joining me. I wanted to give some of my perceptions on workplace violence. I've been dealing with workplace violence. I'm really passionate about it, really not about committing it, but moreover, preventing it. I've been following it since OSHA put it together and identified the 4 types of workplace violence. Today, we're going to talk about the progression of workplace violence into what I describe as armed assailant or an active shooter, is most commonly known. So before we begin, I'd like to just talk about, some of the data. So as Amy indicated, I use data to inform on business risks, security risks, exposures, and to help my clients understand how to address those risks in the most economic way possible while minimizing the potential for impact. Workplace violence is a very high impact type of event. The data that I've seen, the after action reports I've recognized, I've noticed that many organizations that experience a workplace violence event that manifests itself into an armed assailant type of incident typically go out of business within 2 to 3 years, or they close their facilities in that area. This is very similar to a fire type of incident. So complementing some of that data, I use public resources, public information, Bureau of Labor and Statistics, OSHA data, as well as the Violence Project, which I'm going to showcase here in a moment. The Violence Project is a collaboration between 2 researchers who have pulled together all the different types of armed assailant events and really provided a very robust review of some aspects on the demographics of the offender, as well as where these incidents are occurring. So let's take a look at that data that is produced by the Violence Project. So first and foremost, I would like to just identify that an armed assailant event is a very rare event. In terms of its impact, it has a very high impact, but in terms of occurrence, it's quite rare. However, when we look at armed assailant, we see in the media that it's produced, that it's in college and universities and K through 12 environments. That really is not the case. It is somewhat misleading, and therefore we need to take a look at that data to really identify if it correlates with our environment to see if we are at more risk. Specifically, when we look at the data and we see the geographical presence of this incident, we start to see some trends in areas of the country, predominantly in the south side, in terms of the south of the country, as well as the west. But it's not happening in schools, K through 12 schools. It's happening in retail environments, and it's happening in manufacturing and factory environments. So I think that's an important distinction to make. The other aspect that we wanted to look at is when we want to understand workplace violence, the best way to address a threat is to look at the commonalities that are produced through that data. And we know that this is a predominantly white male type of situation. We know it's an individual that commits these types of acts has high school degree. Those with higher education, much like criminal justice studies, show that there's less prevalence with people that have higher education because there's arguably more to lose. Now, with that being said, let's look at the data that surrounds the blue collar environment. So we see predominantly this is happening in blue collar environment, but look at what we see in the 93, that percentage articulates the individuals that were working at the time. So there's an aspect of grievance. This also intertwines into incidences like Aurora, Illinois, VTI, shootings that have crossed. People were still at their employer during that time. They were not necessarily terminated and brooding and what have you, which is another something that kind of carries out is that, you know, the person leaves the workforce and then comes back with a vengeance. That data doesn't bear out with that. We look at other data statistics, and this comes from the 2017-2018 FBI statistics. We do see increases in this type of incident. We also see that over the course of the time frame that these incidences are occurring with more prevalence. The data correlates on the FBI side with regards to where these incidences are occurring. So education is kind of showcased here, but the commerce, which brings up the manufacturing, retail environments, are also correlating with the Violence Project data. Unfortunately and regrettably, we do see that there's a tendency for these types of incidents to create significant amounts of harm or injury. And that's one thing that's coming out of this data is that we're having more injuries as a result of these incidences. I think one of the most telling aspects of this is my observation and the observation of colleagues that have followed this is that there's a phenomenon called leakage. And specifically, the Secret Service noted in their study of active shooters that in 81% of the cases they reviewed, one person knew. And in 59% of the times of those incidences, two persons knew. So this really drives home the requirements and the needs for communication and early detection to respond and minimize the outcome, the negative outcomes that can come as a result of workplace violence progressing into armed assailant. When we think about the motivation for workplace violence, robbery is definitely an aspect of workplace violence, but the other types are really tied to emotional aspects. We've seen from data that has been produced on law enforcement deaths that more officers die during domestic incidences other than bank robberies, chasing offenders, or what have you. This is why if you've ever looked down the street and you've seen a whole bunch of squad cars parked outside of a house and kind of thought it was a drug bust or what have you, that really isn't the reason. The reason is they're pulling in additional support to minimize the potential for violence against their fellow officer. So emotions is really one of the most difficult and concerning types of crimes that can occur. And that's why when we talk about workplace violence, we see that association to emotions, which calls out and drives some of the outcomes that we've seen. So when we think about, armed assailant, I think one of the things that we want to talk about is what have we done wrong? I mean, in predominantly when we started tracking this and put a word workplace violence and active shooter, to the term that has mass casualties associated to it, we've recognized that, listen, there's just things that we've reacted to. Good example, the term active shooter. There's other implements that can cause harm. Why do we always focus on just weapons? Arguably, a bladed weapon could be just as severe or even worse. The other aspects to response. Previously, we would respond and stage outside the facility. Now we've learned that we need to get into the facility. Then further learnings that when we got into the facility, we weren't tending to the people that needed aid, and we saw a lot of people that would bleed out as a result of that. So we continue to learn from these events, and regrettably, I'm the individual that's reading these after action reports so I can communicate this information to our clients and what I'm doing here today. Here's another example of what we got wrong from the reactive standpoint. So in this image, we see very positive attributes towards a armed assailant response, spreading out in the room, putting out weapons. This is a fight scenario. But what's interesting is note the individual on the left who is using a fire extinguisher as a weapon. Arguably, it would be more effective to blind the attacker. Another learning lesson that has come out of this progression of armed assailant response, training, and awareness. In this incident, we see that individuals are basically walking out of the facility. Note how they're carrying all their bags and what have you. This really ties to my understanding that when we train on these incidences, on evacuation drills that address workplace violence and armed assailant, we're not really stressing the importance of this event and almost kind of characterizing it as a fire, where this is a much, much faster, rapidly evolving event. So another takeaway from this is stressing the importance of armed assailant. When you hear people screaming, you run the other direction. That's another takeaway, right? So when we first started talking about this, this was if you hear shots fired. Again, other implements can be used. A common theme seen in emergency would be screaming. This is another good image that just describes the response to armed assailant. So we have an armed assailant response within a retail environment, and this individual is still carrying out his packages. So training can enforce that drop everything and go means drop everything and go. Another example, an orderly evacuation where, again, people have papers and books and backpacks and grab their computers. That is not the type of response that we need during these types of incidences. The other items that we get wrong. So in this video here on the left, we see officers that are running. Why are they running towards the building? Why aren't they driving vehicles to the building? We also see an orderly evacuation from the building. People aren't running away to get away from the building when there is arguably an armed assailant in the building. And we've seen statistically that armed assailants will shoot outside windows.
Well, no one said nothing to me yet, so.
Another factor in training which should be established. Another reactionary aspect that I saw during K through 12 was door blockers, as seen in this image on the right. Now, door blockers make sense for when you're in a shelter-place condition, but not for an exterior door that would impede first responders from gaining access to the building. These are some of the things that we need to think about when we're discussing, addressing, and learning from an armed assailant event. Other aspects. Across the pond in the United Kingdom, they have reacted to stab vests. So they don't have weapons, but they do have bladed events that occurred out there. And so how they have addressed this is much like a life jacket that hangs on a wall, you have a stab vest that you would go grab. Is that the right approach? Armored backpacks I've seen for schools, victim cards that you would place under the door to alert first responders that there's people injured inside the building. But arguably, you would be communicating to an offender that you are in that room and you are with injured. Is that something that we want to be doing? Magnetometers for schools with individuals that don't have training on what to do during that incident. Or my favorite, the mini bat, where a school actually bought mini bats to fight off an offender. This is all the learned experiences that we've had and things that we need to address in the future for a more positive response and to minimize the outcome of this type of event. We're always looking for that single thing, that one widget that I can buy, that device that basically produces and identifies muzzle flash, or sound systems that can identify the type and caliber of weapons. I've actually seen companies that have produced equipment that would have weapons inside enclosures that would shoot people from a 24/7 stationed location. There's always this reactionary aspect that we need to find this one solution. The solution is, this is an interdisciplinary response. It involves multiple elements, architecture, technology, as well as, more importantly, operations. And when we have this program put together, I feel that we can offset the potential for workplace violence incidences in the future. One of those key components of operations is communication. Communication before, during, and after an incident. Let's explore that. So the first aspect when we're training, when I was a little kid and I jumped on a bicycle, I had training wheels, right? It taught me how what I could expect from the bike and my unevenness on riding it. Now, the thing when we're talking about riding a bike is the training wheels have to come off at some point, but we never forget how to learn a bike, how to ride a bike. I suggest that training should be the same. We should establish protocols and continue to train. Don't take those training wheels off until we're absolutely certain that our staff members, our employees, our visitors and patrons know how to respond to this type of incident. Operations is also going to involve a very formalized workplace violence program. And that workplace violence program is going to require a workplace violence team. Determining if someone is at risk or if they're a threat to the environment should not be placed on a single individual. This should be a collaborative effort. And through this awareness, I believe, again, and communication, that we can minimize the potential for incidences occurring in the future. People just don't snap. There's the phenomenon of leakage that occurs, indirect, direct threats that occur. These are all warning signs and the potential for making it less likely to occur at your facility. So training. What type of training do we want to look for? Well, arguably, one of the most effective trainings that everyone should start looking at is Stop the Bleed. Stop the Bleed addresses some of our learning lessons from earlier shootings where we saw many people expire as a result of blood loss. Simple techniques, tourniquets, compression, teaching people what to do during these incidences not only benefits them in the workplace, but it benefits them outside the workplace where they might have an incident or an injury that occurs at home. Training has to also include de-escalation. De-escalation is by far one of the best opportunities to address someone who is potentially going to act out. This means getting them to calm down, breaking that violence continuum. And then staff response also needs to be considerate of the event as well, not only during the event, but after the event. We need to understand what to do when law enforcement arrives. Many trainings do not address this. Recognize running up to a law enforcement officer doing an active event makes for a very difficult situation for that law enforcement officer to process. So how do we address that when law enforcement gets on our site? What other tools and elements can we implement at our facilities to support a law enforcement response if that should occur? How do we stop it? So it talked about communication, but moreover, it's my belief that we have had an instinctual element, our gut, listening to our gut. And this video here shows how we don't listen to our gut. We are so distracted easily by the phone. This, I think, if we can get back to listening to our gut and recognizing that, he made a statement that really made me feel uneasy, I probably should communicate that to someone. I have been involved in many workplace violence incidences where we were able to offset the potential for disaster as a result of a employee or a patron communicating something that we didn't know otherwise. This really ties to the duty report. Do you have methods at your organization to communicate? And do you have multiple methods? Text, phone, email, ethics reporting, third-party reporting. All of these elements are extremely important. Does your managers have the relationships with their employees where they will communicate this information without fear of retaliation? Do your managers know how to address the potential for threatening acts, such as, an individual putting things in order? Well, I got to get my will done. I got to do this. I got to get this all closed off by the end of this week. Understanding what a direct and implied threat is. When someone does this to you, that is workplace violence. We shouldn't dismiss it. It's also a form of leakage that gives us an indication of that person's mental state and the potential for progression to them where they may act out. So as we kind of close out this discussion, what do we want? We want policies. We want weapons policies. With our weapons policies, we want to not only address there are no weapons allowed in our facility, but we want to address those individuals that will carry weapons, especially in states that permit it. This is important because the organization needs to inform and communicate people and train people that don't take your gun chasing after the bad guy because you're not trained, and you're potentially going to have an interaction with law enforcement that is going to delay law enforcement in addressing the actual actor on site. Make sure we have methods to communicate and make sure those methods are communicated widely. Use posters, use your intranet. Make sure that they have a phone number or email that can get this information to the people so they can make informed decisions about these risks. Your threat assessment team should have access to or awareness of a clinical psychologist that could help enable the team and understand what types of controls could be implemented to further diminish the capacity for that person to act out, and also understand what things they should not do. People react differently to different types of controls. The retaliation components of your policies need to be very straightforward and follow that whistleblower approach where they are not going to be retaliated against. So as I close out this presentation, why is communication, in my opinion, one of the most important aspects to preventing violence? The next videos I'm going to show you could be emotional for some, especially those that have family members that have been involved with an armed assailant. I encourage you, if you feel that you might be susceptible, to stop watching or turn the audio off at this time.
Hello, my name is Nick, and I'm going to be the next school shooter of 2018. My goal is at least 20 people with an AR-15 and a couple tracer rounds. I think I can get it done. Location is Stone Douglas in Parkland, Florida. It's going to be a big event. And when you see me on the news, you'll all know who I am. You're all going to die. Pew, 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 pew. Yeah. Can't wait. Alright, so here's the plan. I'm gonna go take an Uber in the afternoon before 2:40. From there, I'll go onto school campus, walk up the stairs, unload my bags, and get my AR and shoot people down at the main courtyard. I'll wait, and people will die.
Let's look at another time
For those of you retards
where
who don't know who
we
I
have an
am,
individual
I'm the
at
Freedom
another
High
time
School
frame that
shooter
made a similar threat.
in Tampa, Florida. Well, I will be in a couple months. I thought I'd just run over my gameplay with y'all. The cafeteria at Freedom. My plan is to set a bomb here at point A, here at point B, point C, and point D. Then I gotta get to the side entrance of the school by 7:24. The bombs blow at 726, and then I'm going to advance on the courtyard. I'm going to come in and advance on the courtyard where probably be at least 60 people come through the door, then shoot everybody at the front desk. Mr. Costanzo's office is right here. I got to kill him. Miss Carmody is here. I got to kill her. Mr. Pierce is here. I got to make sure he doesn't die because I like him. Did I choose to think like this? No, that's just how I am. If you don't like it, just find a way to find people like me and just line us up and shoot us.
The two instances are different in that one was a success story and one wasn't, but they were all produced via social media. Leakage. Leakage occurs and is common with our offenders. Recognize leakage, and then when you see it, ensure that you communicate it to authorities to prevent this from occurring. The Freedom High School shooting did not occur, arguably would have been worse than Columbine. The reason it didn't occur was someone saw that video and communicated it to police. When the police went to his house with a search warrant, they found explosives, guns, and a plan for attack. This is how we prevent workplace violence in the future. Communication. Because 81% of the time, one person knew, and 59% of the time, two persons knew. That concludes this discussion on leakage. If you'd like to follow me on LinkedIn, you can do so. Sean Aarons, I put a lot of good information up there regarding vulnerabilities that I identify. I welcome connections, and I appreciate your time. Amy, let's see if we got any questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you again, Sean. This is a very important topic and something that is not just in the workplace life, but in general. We need to make sure that if we notice things in our lives that we communicate that. We do have a few questions coming in. Just a reminder to type in any questions you have in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. Sean, what types of workplace violence are most concerning for you as a security advisor?
Type 4, domestic spillover. Those are the ones that are most emotionally charged. I had an incident where I was working with a healthcare. The woman was uncontrollably sobbing. An employee saw that. She was out of place because she just received lilies, and she communicated to HR. After we had HR speak with that woman, it was determined that they were going through a very bad divorce. He had written, made multiple writings, videos, and communicated via text on how he was going to kill her and where he was going to kill her. We got in front of that. We were able to move her to a different location. That same day, we caught on camera a vehicle that matched his description driving through the parking lot, ostensibly looking for her car.
The prevention is so powerful. We have another question from an audience member. Do you feel active shooters should be performed in the workplace? HR can be against this due to liability. We do video training, but is that enough?
I do not believe video training is enough because it really, the brain doesn't like boring things. And a good example of this is, tell me the last commercial you saw, right? You need an interactive presence. I mean, you can support video training afterwards, but you need to have your safety group or what have you getting in and doing this training. Does this have to be with Nerf guns shooting people? Another overreaction to this incident? No. But can we tell them the key things that they want to be aware of? Can we talk to them about stop the bleed and simple things that we can do to prevent someone from bleeding out in the facility? Can we emphasize that communication aspect, and we're going to follow through this and we're going to do an investigation? Yes, we can do that in a way that is not emotional and conveys information. And as we repeat that information over and over, at some point, we can take the training wheels off.
Perfect. Sean, I know, somebody's asking if you can give moreover examples of in spite spillover.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Somebody's asking, can you give more examples of a site spillover?
Site spillover. Oh, so domestic spillover?
Yeah, I think so.
So domestic spillover is where we have an intimate partner or family member that is connected to a subject within the workplace. And as a result of emotions, it could be a love triangle, it could be a divorce or what have you, the individual, the offender acts out in the place where the individual is working. When we look at when I'm dealing with executives, individuals of high worth, their three vulnerabilities are office, in travel, and at home. So if our offender knows where we are, it's likely that we would have an attack happen at home or potentially work, because that is probably the best opportunity to catch someone.
Sean, have you seen people acting out of anger for how loved ones were treated in a clinical or hospital environment? In other words, the family member blames the hospital for that person's death.
Absolutely. Healthcare and our response to COVID as a result of what I call the cashier philosophy are all motivators for the potential for violence. We do see a significant amount of violence from patients on staff, but this also extends to loved ones. It's very difficult sometimes when a loved one doesn't recognize the process of what's going on. I've seen individuals act out in an emergency department, and again, let's stress communication. So emergency department, person comes in with his child, she's throwing up. Other people are coming into the emergency department with higher triage. They pain in the chest, things that are more life-threatening. The child is not being seen. The parent becomes more and more angry. At some point, he starts yelling at the nurse, which we know from yelling, your next thing is going to be an assault. Security's called, and a form of enforcement really keeps ratcheting him up. How do we address that? What could we have done? We could have gone to that person and said, listen, I know your child's very important to us, but we have a couple other very, very ill people that are potentially life-threatening. We're going to address them first. Is there anything I can get? Can I get you some water? Can I get you some food? What have you? These are all aspects of de-escalation that can be managed. What? Through communication. So yes, I do see it happening. And a large amount of those cases are a result of a lack of communication.
Sean, I know some facilities have gone away. It used to be coded, code red situation. I know some of them are now verbalizing what the issue is. What's your take on versus using code words versus non-code words?
I truly believe that plain language should be used. There are different schools of thought, like the initial response could be code words to avoid a panic. However, if you have an armed assailant in your facility, or if you have some other type of incident that is occurring, you will have individuals that don't know what those code words mean. So in hospitals, we see those used quite often, like code silver, code blue, what have you. And when you call a code silver, staff are running all over the place, but the individuals that don't know what those codes mean are what's going on, what's happening, right? So again, communication. Communication is key. Plain language. And then when we do these responses, make sure that you continue to provide direction. So it's not just one response over the PA that says, there's an armed assailant in the event, please take shelter or evacuate if possible. And another information, and then you follow up to say, and additional information will be provided in 5 minutes, right? We continue that communication to let them people. So 5 minutes for someone in a shelter-in-place condition where they think someone is hunting them, that's an eternity. So we need to continue to give updates about what is going on. Law enforcement is on site, what have you. These are all positive attributes to communication that need to be basically delivered within your crisis management program.
Someone's asking, based on the presentation, is the video Run, Hide, Fight still relevant? And if not, is there another one that's become more updated?
Run, hide, fight is absolutely relevant. However, it misses some elements like communication. We start to see now run, hide, fight videos have aspects of communication in them, such as dialing 911, identifying where you should come into the building, what the offender looks like. All of those things are very, very important. They're not necessarily addressed on the early run, hide, fight situations. So run, hide, fight makes a lot of sense. It's immediate. People will understand this is what I got to do. But we also need to address that communication component. And the communication also needs to extend beyond just dialing 911. We have seen in some incidences that people who evacuate as a result of an armed assailant towards the end of the day, 3, 4 o'clock, go home. Now we have an organization that is mustering people and they're looking for John, Tim, Chrissy, who have left, but they did not communicate they left. We are wasting resources looking for those individuals during an emergency. So this is where we can tie in technology such as SMS, mass notification systems to communicate, are you okay? Are you safe? Or what have you, and be able to muster very quickly and limit our applicability to resources and put those resources where we need them during that type of incident. Again, communication.
And I would think you could use then your space management technology too to tell where people are in the building too, if you're in like a hybrid environment where people might not necessarily be in the building every day anymore.
So if we do have the capability for identifying where people are in a building using occupancy-based sensors, and we have granularity on that information, or just have general ideas, that's information that law enforcement would benefit from. That would fall into your crisis response plan. So we're going to access this and find out where people are in the building so we can communicate it to law enforcement. So they know where to respond, get people evacuating. It might be a 2-tier process, right? We have active individuals looking for the aggressor, and then we have other individuals, law enforcement or first responders, evacuating people out where we know that the assailant isn't. So these are all aspects. Surveillance cameras, very powerful, can be used by first responders if we have the training, if we know that the system works, and we have the ability to produce that information on site.
Sean, I know you talked about it being a multidisciplinary, team that needs to put this together, but is there one department that you've seen that should really spearhead, whether it's security, HR, or facility managers?
It differs from organization to organization. Security should definitely be front and center on this because they control all the aspects of prevention, management, and response to this type of incident. They will work in close consort with human resources to address preventative aspects. To managing aspect of workplace violence. In manufacturing facilities, we don't necessarily see security directors or security staff in those facilities, not all, predominantly, but maybe that's an opportunity for environmental health and safety to pick up that hat, to support that training for workplace violence prevention and minimize this type of incident, again, in consort with human resources. There's also other aspects to this management, this crisis that we need to address is insurance, right? So the impact of this organization, when you have an event, that occurs, we have to understand what are we going to do if the offender doesn't take their own life. That means that this facility is a crime scene. So you're losing that operation. So how does that roll into our business continuity planning, our insurance program elements, and what have you? The other aspect of this communication, when individuals that deal with post-traumatic stress, they can actually deal with this better if we've shown historically they can deal with this better if they start the venting process as soon as possible. So what type of insurance programs do we have to get on site to address that post-traumatic stress, dealing with counseling and what have you for individuals that were not directly affected, but were involved in the incident? This is all going to help us restore our organization much faster and recover from the incident. Again, communication.
Yeah. We've had a few questions about your kind of view on either training employees on weapons or training them in hand-to-hand physical confrontation on how to handle situations. Any viewpoint you'd like to share there?
I believe that we can do more with our words and our body language. I mean, just simply by talking like this, I'm open, like, how can I help you, right? What am I saying when I say this, right? So recognizing our somatic as well as our verbal cues and tonality and being able to de-escalate. I don't think we ever get to the point of fighting. If someone's getting close to me, I could say, well, could you just stay back from me? This is a non-threatening gesture, right? I'm not the advocate for arming staff. I'm not the advocate for teaching people how to fight in these types of incidences in terms of a fisticuff type of thing. In the run, hide, fight scenario, yes, we want to group together. We want to find implements to basically either blind or incapacitate our attacker. And we want to basically attack as one, right? All at once. These are all components that we've addressed from our learned lessons in run, hide, fight. But I think they're augmented by some other aspects, such as de-escalation training, which many organizations are not really using as effectively as they can. Healthcare is a great example where de-escalation has been extremely beneficial. Psychiatric facilities, also another great example where de-escalation can be very beneficial.
Sean, for the facility managers on the call, can you talk a little bit about preventative maintenance in the buildings and how that can impact potential workplace violence?
Well, preventative maintenance, if I have to understand, I think that what we want to talk about is door locking. So the exterior doors, when they close, they're locked. Then no one can get in, right? So we don't want people to be able to shim the door open, whatever. So lock maintenance becomes very extremely important. Surveillance systems, updating surveillance systems. If we have a domestic spillover, that doesn't mean it happens in the workplace. Someone could be shot outside the parking lot. Is there adequate lighting? Was the path to the vehicles lit well so they could see around their surroundings and support their own security? These are all probably aspects of preventative maintenance that I think that would be beneficial. Hardened perimeters, making sure our fence is secured. Someone can't squeeze through or come through and bypass security in some way, or be able to smuggle weapons in without our knowledge.
Are there any, you talk about, you do spend a lot of your days working on some of the architectural changes to buildings to minimize security. Is there anything you're seeing right now in terms of building design to take a look at for facility violence and armed assailants?
So it varies from environment to environment. I am the big fan of low cubes. The reason I'm a big fan for low cubes is we've got line of sight. Also for first responders, they can see the entire environment, as opposed to high cubes, which actually turns an office into a maze. It makes it much more difficult to clear. From an architectural standpoint, the lockdown feature. This is something that we're applying in manufacturing facilities, office facilities. A known threat is inbound to the facility. What do? We lock down the doors and we communicate evacuation processes or communicate response mechanisms, like, everybody to the west side of the building, or law enforcement has arrived, being able to use technology to support that communication. So there are aspects of architectural elements that come into play, the ballistics aspects and that I don't really see a big component of that, except where we have individuals that are dealing with the public and they might become violent, municipalities and or healthcare environments. So it's elongating those desks. Many of the nurses' desks that I'm designing for healthcare, I have elongated writing surfaces specifically designed so they can't reach over the counter and grab the person, right? So we're adding aspects of deter, delay, and response to the architectural components.
Perfect. We have another question on what's the most effective, the written policy and procedure or the on-site in-person training, or a combination of both?
You absolutely need to have a policy. You need policies. The policy is, we have a workplace violence program where we can, I believe zero tolerance. Many people think that that's not possible, but I believe in zero tolerance. If you commit an act of workplace violence, if we investigate it, this is going to be a terminatable offense. Now, from that policy, we go into procedures. How do we implement that policy? Part of those procedures is going to be training. That training is going to address how we respond to workplace violence. Workplace violence response in a waste management facility is going to be much more difficult, or not difficult, different than responding to workplace violence in an office building, right? So there's components and elements that we need to address, and we need to understand all of our resources, right? So that has to be tied into our procedures. Do we have the ability for a public address? Do we have mass notification? Do we have cellular repeatability? Do we know, has law enforcement seen our site? These are all components in procedures that tie to our workplace violence policy where we're trying to prevent this from occurring.
Right. And Sean, can you talk a little bit about at what point law enforcement should come into play when you're kind of building these policies and procedures and training programs?
Law enforcement should be, well, there's a couple components here. So one, with law enforcement, we have to understand the response to the incident, to the individual that made the threats. So the individual that came in and says, I'm going to kill you in so many bloody ways, and they're arrested, they're put in, they're not going to be going to jail, most likely. They're going to be getting out on an individual recognizance bond that day. So it's important for you to partner with law enforcement so you understand and they understand what their roles are in this response mechanism, and you understand what their response is going to be to this type of incident, because it helps you adjust your program to manage this concern, right? So are we going to be able to communicate with that individual after they go home? Are we going to be able to have eyes on them as to, are they becoming more angry or violent? Are we talking to other employees about what's going on? So these are all components to that element that we need to understand. But more importantly, and it's very difficult to do now, we live in an environment where law enforcement has been criticized and almost bastardized over the course of 4 or 5 years. And law enforcement, as a result, has lost many people that are experienced, as well as trying to onboard new people. So they don't have the resources or the budget to do some of these programs. So whenever you can, try to get law enforcement to your facility so they have an understanding of what's in there. How long would it take to clear? How would they come from, the building? Would they come in from the east side or the west side? How would they approach the incident? This is very valuable information that could make the difference in time in response. So I really advocate, if you can, get law enforcement to your site and educate them on the inner workings of your facility and what resources you have to support them during that. It also makes sense for you to partner with their public relationships. So your public relations, so you're sending out the same information, because there will be media involvement in this type of incident. And then finally, understand what their response is going to be to, an infraction where an assault, a verbal assault was made, and your concerns as opposed to what is legally permissible.
Perfect. Well, I think we're getting to the end of some of the questions. One final question somebody asked is, when do you use the overhead PA, and what's the best scenario to alert a message to the entire building?
As soon as possible, as soon as an event occurs, if there's screaming overheard and it's determined that this is an armed assailant, typically it'll come over like a walkie-talkie or what have you. We want to get that information out to the masses as quickly as possible. So public address, and we also want to think about outbound public address, right? Because there's individuals that might be walking into the building and don't know what's going on, right? So we want to communicate to as many people through as many modalities as possible about the event that's occurring and what the process is. If you're coming to the building, don't come to the building. If you're in the building under a mass notification approach, if you have that capability, leave out of the west side. One of the learning lessons that we identified and should be applied to training is don't pull the fire alarm, because that is now going to trigger a educational response, and people potentially will be put in the path of an aggressor. Don't pull the fire alarm. Use communication methods to describe if you're using a fire system, if you're planning on upgrading your fire system. Great opportunity to introduce the double strobe. The double strobe allows you to communicate during a fire and non-fire event. Some individuals have gone to the fire alarm panel, pull the handset to make the alert to recognize that it starts the fire alarm sequence. So be aware of your communication processes. What will happen during those types of incidents is if you try to use the voice evac system, would that start a fire alarm condition? Think about the future on how we might be able to communicate to masses both inside and outside quickly and efficiently. either via text and or audio communication.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Sean, for this great information. I know it's life-saving information for the participants on this call today. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
We talked about leakage, and the aspects of leakage do occur. They happen in many incidences that I have had the morbid responsibility of reading. What it comes down to is communication. Communication is one of the key elements of this response mechanism that we're still learning and we're still advancing. And through this communication, I do believe that we can offset future events. I've been involved in a number of incidences that have been prevented as a result of just someone picking up the phone and saying, this just seems odd. So everybody, listen to your gut. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I put a lot of information out there, nothing self-serving. I'm always trying to assist and try to present information where possible about business risks and exposures. And have a safe day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Just a reminder, this presentation will be archived at facilitiesnet.com/webcast, and you'll get an email after the event with a link to take the CEU assessment. And we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you again for Traka for sponsoring today's event, and have a wonderful and safe day. Thanks, everyone.